another year, another series of Meet Magento events. So I'm very fortunate to be here as people still pour in. Now, I know this has an international connotation, so that's why I'm going to do this in English. But I do have something to say in French as well. So I'm not French speaking. I'm a Belgian, Dutch speaking. But who here speaks French? Donc, je suis désolé, mais aujourd'hui, je vais parler en anglais. Donc, je suis beaucoup plus à l'aise en anglais qu'en français, mais je voudrais bien vous accueillir ici et vous souhaiter le bienvenue. On est au Meet Magento Paris, donc je suis très content d'être ici. Et on va continuer, we will continue in English straight away, because I know the front row are filled with people who do not speak French. So, here we go. Hi everyone, my name is Thijs. Yes, that's how you pronounce that, and I'm very used to explaining it. I'm a Dutch-speaking Belgian, mais comme vous savez, je parle aussi un peu français. And I'm the tech evangelist at a company called Varnish Software. And I know tech evangelist, it's quite a lot, and the picture certainly doesn't help. But what I do is a lot of outreach. I do a ton of presentations. Today is my 376th presentation, and I create content, I make video content, I write tutorials. I'm also an author. I wrote Getting Started with Varnish Cache. Tremendous honor being an O'Reilly author. Look, I got my little bird on there. But based on my facial expression, not really too excited anymore about that book. It's an old book, so we wrote a new one called Varnish 6 by Example. I have a free copy. I'm not taking this back home. Either someone is going to take this or the cleanup crew is going to throw this in the bin. So it's either of those. I wrote this during the COVID pandemic. Lockdowns were long, 778-pager. You know the drill. Right? So I work for Varnish Software. Who has heard of Varnish Software before? Just to check. Great. Now, I am still getting used to the fact that in the Magento world, people know us. I'm very used to explaining what we do and justifying our existence. Hi, David. Welcome. So in case you don't know who we are a company that builds software-defined web acceleration and content delivery solutions with a very strong emphasis on software-defined. Just a software company, not a platform. You can run it wherever you want. You can run it on-prem on your own machines or work with a hosting provider. You can leverage our products in the cloud using the official machine images that are available with pre-installed versions of Varnish on the different cloud platforms. Or you can pull in our official Docker image and you can orchestrate that using help charts. So it's there wherever you want it to be. But I do acknowledge, and I have to acknowledge, that despite me working for a company that builds these type of solutions, most of you will probably know us as the company behind the open source project. And that is true, and that is still a fact. And we fund the project, and we assign development resources to it. But as you'll hear throughout this presentation, we don't control the open source project, which is a very good thing. Because why would corporate... Well, this is maybe a tricky event to talk about this, right? But why would any corporation dictate and control the open source, right? So we're part of it. I'm sorry, it's not a dig, it's accidental. I'm just explaining how things work at us. And that will come to some interesting problems that we will try to solve. So we'll get there. So in case you don't know how this thing works, because caching, there's tons of caching. There's caching in Magento at different levels, and even the systems you run have a level of caching. We assume the role of a reverse caching proxy, meaning we store the responses that Magento generates for two reasons. Reason number one, and if you, who saw Jakub's talk earlier about performance? A couple of people. Well, he explained quite eloquently what some of the challenges are with Magento from the inside. So what we're doing is we're providing an origin shield layer around Magento to take away a lot of the pressure when there's a lot of visitors on the system. So that's one thing. It's called quality of service. But of course, as we cache these objects, which could be images, pages, categories, whatever Magento puts in there, we can serve at rapid pace to the users. And I mean rapid pace. We're benchmarked at 1.7 terabits per second on a single machine. We can, of course, your network won't support it, but we can do sub-millisecond latency. We can handle up to, I think, 3 million requests per second, some cases, of course, with beefy hardware. But the point I'm trying to make is by positioning your cache strategically, you can reduce network latency, which is a customer experience kind of thing. So how do you control it? How do you run it? Well, we're not reinventing the wheel. As long as HTTP emits conventional headers, we'll support them. So this is what Magento will throw out when you start returning a cacheable page. It will try to cache it for a day. So that's quick maths for you there. I cached this, I didn't calculate it, 86,400 seconds is a day. Now, of course, there's a lot of instances in Magento where you'll render hyper-personalized content that is not cacheable, and then Magento will emit either of those and will respect that. However, Magento plays its own game, and it doesn't always conform to HTTP standards. There are very specific things in there. I'm going to throw in one. Magento is very keen on always setting a cookie whenever it sees fit. Set cookie, set cookie, set cookie. These things aren't really cacheable. So we need to circumvent that. And we have our own programming language built into Varnish called the Varnish Configuration Language, VCL. It's not a top-down programming language. It's just a language that hooks into this finite state machine. Yes, usually when I do training, I spend about half an hour explaining this. My total session duration is 20 to 25 minutes. So we're not going to go into the details. But I can assume, right, it's not too much to ask, that you can interpret what a flowchart does. What the language does is it extends all these different boxes. Each of these boxes represents an execution state in the flow of the cache. So there is standard behavior that corresponds and works really well in terms of HTTP's best practices and conventions. But if something is specific, like Magento, we can extend the different boxes with VCL code. So that's what you do. You extend, you don't have to define all the behavior. Quick run through, let's do two very quick scenarios. You start at the start, of course, obviously, and you enter into this thing called VCL rec v, very cryptic. It's short for VCL receive. You receive the request. If you want to extend that, you will determine or define a subroutine in your VCL file where you will alter this logic. And you can do transitions to other states by doing return statements, which are represented by all these lines. So let's start with a very simple one. Receive a request, it's deemed cacheable. We do return hash to create a hash key, which uses the host header and the URL, composes a hash key, runs a hashing algorithm on it, does a lookup here in VCL hash, and damn it, it is a cache miss. So we follow the blue line. Now, of course, cache misses are pretty decent because that's just a hit that hasn't happened yet. It could be worse, right? It could be a pass that bypasses the cache. So it's a miss. We haven't got the object in the cache. Tough luck. We will do a fetch. Everything in this gray box is communication with your backend. I see people in the back trying to see it. I will publish these slides online, and the gentleman is filming it, so I'm pretty sure all this information will be available. So I have to fetch, which is taking a copy of the request, sending it to Magento. The fetch comes back. There's a response. We determine whether the response is cacheable. In this case, it is. We decide how long we want to cache it, maybe a day. Store it, deliver it, done. That's the hard way. That's the miss. Next time around, very same flow. Receive, hash, lookup, hit, deliver, done. And here's your first piece of code that does this. Now, of course, our responsibility is not solely determining what is cacheable and what is not cacheable, but also improving the hit rate. And what happens here is a lot of optimizations using ugly regular expression substitutions to ensure that the URL and the host header are as optimized as possible. Because security 101, don't trust the user. So if the URL ends with a question mark, someone has been doing some weird stuff, right? So we had the intention to provide URL query string parameters, but we didn't. Now, from a content perspective, that's not bad. The output will be the same. From a caching perspective, the URL will differ. It's a different string. The hash key will be different, and we have cache misses. So we need to tackle this. Do it here. Trim off potential port numbers that sneak up in the host header. Alphabetically sort query string parameters, and so on and so forth. That's VCL receive. This is an override and part of the Magento template. Now, of course, in VCL backend response, which is part of the execution flow when you receive a response from Magento prior to storing it in the cache, what we do is we assign a level of staleness, which we'll come back to, which will turn out to be very important. So if the content has expired, as you can see in the comment, we will keep serving it for the next 3 days while we do asynchronous revalidation. And then, of course, here's that cookie business. We know Magento is very keen on the set cookies, but what we do is, if the content is cacheable because the TTL is greater than 0, and we're not changing anything, so we're doing a get or a head, just remove the set cookie and make it cacheable. So that's that. And it's part of a bigger VCL template that we don't have time to cover, and we're trying to make it better. Who is we? Well, a bunch of us. And it was actually Peter Blaakmeer, who is from the Dutch from the Dutch Magento community, who approached me at a conference and said, Thijs, do you want to make the VCL code better? Because whatever Magento spits out in the interface, it's not quite there. And I could do an entire rant, but we don't have time for it, and we're trying to keep it respectful, right? Just this gist has, as a foundational goal, become the final gist before we have something we can consider a PR that Adobe would accept or Magento would accept. And it's a living thing. We got a lot of feedback on there, and I take it and update it in our official developer portal article. So whenever you type Varnish Magento, this was probably a top 5 result, right? And if you use it, and I encourage you to use this template, and you see things you don't like or that could be improved, reach out to me or drop a comment in this gist, which you'll also find if you Google it. We're very much open to making this better. This is our contribution, but unfortunately, there's a lot to it. Like, this is solely matching URL parameters, marketing URL parameters. Remember, you do a newsletter, you want to track the campaign and the source and whatever. These things mess with your hit rate, so you need to trim them off. And this is a list of URL parameters we trim off. It's a living thing, let us know. But, and here's where we transition into the next session of the presentation, there are limitations. Not necessarily limitations to Magento, not necessarily limitations to the VCL file, but limitations to Varnish itself. And that's where what we do and what the open source does comes at a little bit of a clash. So what we notice that annoys the hell out of us is that open source doesn't have TLS handling natively yet. And there's good reasons for it, or the project lead has good reasons for it. I'm not going to elaborate on the details, but it doesn't have it. You have to terminate TLS using a TLS proxy. There are no dynamic backends, which we'll get to as well. Cache invalidation is a bit tricky and limited, and there's no soft purges in the core. Storage and memory management is sometimes tough to handle, and understanding and debugging VCL for some people is quite tricky. So I come bearing options. Oh, I also come bearing gifts. So who likes to have a Varnish pair of socks? Anyone? Yeah, there you go. Anyone more? Yes. You all, do you have socks? You already have socks. So we'll make sure that the people who took the effort of being on the front row get rewarded. Thank you, thank you. This is not a comedy show. I will not heckle you. But we saw some of these limitations and we try to tackle it. Remember, we don't have full control over open source. So the first thing I'd like to show you is how we offer you native TLS. So we offer a way to do port 443 both at the front end and the back end. So if you do that, of course, you need to define a port. And anyone using Varnish and terminating TLS will probably already assign a port, and it could be 443. The difference is that you can annotate it with the HTTPS keyword and start assigning certificates. The fun thing about the certificate management is that it's dynamic. So if your certificates get outdated, you need to update them again. You don't need to flush the cache or restart the process. This is very dynamic. And the way you would load them, and here's an example script, is through a set of commands you could put here. You can load your certificate. Maybe your private key is in a different file. Maybe you have crypto requirements. You can mention it all. You put it in a file and you dynamically link it with the -i uppercase runtime parameter. And whenever Varnish starts, certificates will be loaded. And I promised you end-to-end TLS. Well, here's the back-end side of things. We added verbiage syntax to enable SSL. You set it to 1. These are always on. SNI, verify peer, verify host. You can fiddle about. Maybe you have a sort of a self-signed certificate that you don't want verified. Well, that's all possible. So that's there. That's step 1. From a security perspective, we noticed that there is a need for native TLS. We developed that from a performance perspective because one of our clients used our technology and didn't like the fact that we can only do 250 gigs a second. And they wanted to go, of course that was not a Magento use case, more of a video use case, but we developed native TLS not solely from a convenience perspective, very much from a performance perspective. Which brings us to number 2, the memory governor. Yes, I designed this in Illustrator because I found this to be a very interesting name. Yes, it governs the memory, it controls the memory. It is a control feature where, interestingly, the memory governor limits the memory, not necessarily of the cache, but of the entire Varnish process. It limits the memory footprint on the system. And it's very much based on a common misconception in the Varnish community that if you use the standard memory allocator and you assign 8 gigabytes, that your total memory footprint on the server will be 8 gigabytes. That's not the case. The storage will be 8 gigabytes. But there's runtime requirements, of course. There's accounting for objects, and that could consume memory as well. And you wouldn't be the first to go out of memory because you didn't anticipate server dimensioning properly. So we got you covered there. What we do is by assigning MSC, which is part of a bigger storage engine called the Massive Storage Engine, we give you the memory governor. So how that works is, let's take the low traffic pattern, for example. You have a server, 100 gigs, you want to leave 10 gigs of headroom. Then, of course, you have a little bit of object accounting, depending on the size of the cache, how many objects are there. These are exaggerated numbers. And, of course, request handling. Threads coming in to handle requests, setting up TCP sessions, doing the backend connections. All of that requires a little bit of memory. And the more complicated your VCL is, the more memory it will take. And then the rest of it is assigned to caching. Imagine having a sudden traffic spike, which would be something that I wish that would happen to you. Maybe you do a marketing campaign that's extremely successful. People buy these limited edition products that you're selling, and all of a sudden there's an onslaught of traffic. But luckily, we've got you covered because that 500 megabytes now is 8 gigabytes. Whoops, problem? Not quite, because we dynamically resize the cache to ensure that the memory balance is harmonized. Quite important to some of our clients and something we would definitely advocate. How do you set it up? Well, it's as simple as doing -s MSE, and 80% of your server's memory will be assigned. Do you want to tweak the parametering? No problem. You can do a dynamic memory target and set it to a percentage or an absolute value. So that way, you can have that equilibrium on your system and that peace of mind. Let me throw in something that I've noticed from the different Meet Magentos that I attended that is quite sensitive. It's a hot topic. And of all the features that I would talk about, this is arguably the most interesting one for Magento developers. It's tag-based cache invalidation with soft purge support, but it's not on the slide. We'll get there. So here we go. This is something I don't quite like. And Ivan pointed out that this expool business has no relevance to Magento. It's Capistrano development, right, Ivan? So this is there. So someone pushed that in there because they thought they needed to invalidate Capistrano pools. It has no relation to Magento. Also, you get penalized when you don't specify the Magento tax pattern. I think there's better ways to approach this. And of course, we're tied into, and it's a must, it's not criticism, it's the reality. We have to use the ban function in Varnish. And the ban function is a function you use to match a regular expression pattern, a certain value that you want to match against a part of the object that is stored in the cache, maybe a header. So in this case, Magento emits the X Magento tags response header containing a collection of tags. You, as who is more technical in the room here? I'm assuming most of the people, right? So you know what Magento tags are. You probably know what they look like. I'll show them in a second. But since we have no native tag-based cache invalidation in the core of Varnish, what we do then is try to do a regular expression match of some pattern. I'll show you that pattern in a second. So it's a bit limited. But here you see, like I'm a big fan of our Varnish logs, you get a backend response in. Again, Magento really trying to set that cookie, right? So keen on the cookie. And it caches. In this case, we try to cache for an hour. And then you see X Magento tag. So you see all these categories trying to be linked. And we store this header, no problem. And we'll cache it for a day. All good. But then invalidations need to happen. Now, of course, Magento ties in quite nicely with Varnish, and when a product update takes place, purge calls happen. Now, purge is pretty much a non-existing or non-attributed request method in HTTP. We invented it, but throughout the caching community, which is a lot larger than just us, we've accepted purge as sort of a method we use with the intention of invalidation. And Magento will use it. It will do a purge. The URL doesn't matter because we're not doing URL-based invalidations. And then you specify the pattern. And Magento knows that Varnish doesn't have native tag-based cache invalidation and tries to throw in regex pattern syntax. A lot of mumbo-jumbo just to bypass that. If you want to wipe the entire cache, it's a regex pattern, **, remove everything. And then in the end, when you do Varnish ADM ban list, because the ban function is an asynchronous function, you will see these ban instructions ending up on the cache ban list. This ban list gets processed by the ban lurker thread asynchronously and has to be matched against every single object in the cache, ladies and gentlemen, which is a little bit of a problem. If you have 1 million objects in the cache, which is not unthinkable, and you have 100 of these are 100 million matches that need to happen. And that could cause a little bit of a CPU spike. So be careful with that. So the way we tackle this is by introducing, of course, before we dive in, a sort of a soft landing. If you don't specify the Magento tags pattern, why not just do a return purge, which just invalidates that single object from the cache based on its URL and its host header. So while Magento won't be using it, if you want to invalidate a page, you just do a purge and specify URL and we'll remove it. But the most important thing is that we will treat the tags that come in as true tags. Remember, this module has native tag-based cache invalidation. You remember this code, Ivan? I stole this code from Ivan. I borrowed it. And Ivan once said that imitation is the greatest form of flattery, and I'll stick to that. So thank you, Ivan. So what Ivan did that I borrowed is he removed all the regular expression mumbo-jumbo from the header and turned it into actual tags.
But the story about this code, so I was asked by a customer to do enterprise-based with Y key, but then someone from community asked, how can I do soft purges? So I did Y key to X key, and now you transform X key to Y key back.
And here we are, full circle, ladies and gentlemen, how great it is. But you'll see, I'll show you, this looks very abstract, but I'll show you how it works, because we're turning it into actual tags, and then we can do purge, header, we know they're comma separated, and that's that. So and then in the end, we can even show you how much objects or how many objects were affected. So log time. Before you can start removing stuff from the cache using tags, you need to register the tags. So this add header specifies a header that you need to inspect, gives you that level of flexibility, and a comma separator in this case. We know the tags will be separated by commas, and we can assign our own key. So every object has the all key, so if you flush the entire cache, it's just a matter of affecting the all key. And then you could see, you again get the X Magento tags header, and every single bit of it, comma separated, is indexed separately and treated as a first-class citizen. Meaning that if we do the invalidation, and these are the logs for the invalidation, and here's where you're going to see where Ivan's code is going to kick in. So this is all really ugly regex stuff for categories. And we say, okay, we're going to receive the request, we're going to match your access control list just to ensure that this is authorized, and then we start. Remove these dashes, remove the commas, remove everything up until we have nothing more than a collection of space-separated tags, which will be indexed. We remove it, and 3 objects got affected. Great. Now, here's the kicker, and the thing you will like the most is if you set the last parameter to true, you're not doing hard purges but soft purges. A hard purge is a regular purge with an intention of wiping things from the cache. But we all know that Magento can have tags that are associated with a lot of products. So if you remove that tag from the cache, a lot of objects will be removed from the cache, which will leave you exposed to a lot of users coming in for those pages. It will slow things down and maybe add a little bit of pressure to the backend. So by setting soft to true, all of a sudden we're not removing the objects from the cache, we're tagging them as invalid. And that's where we dive into the wonderful world of grace that I hinted already in the VCL file. Because the total lifetime of an object is the sum of its TTL, its grace, and its keep. Yes, sounds difficult. Allow me to explain. The TTL, you know this, it starts at 86,400 seconds, and it is a moving target. Every second it goes down until it hits 0. When it hits 0, your object's expired and in need of revalidation. So it will go from hit to miss. However, if we assign grace, which is tolerated staleness, and remember I set it to 3 days, as long as the sum of the TTL and the grace is greater than 0, we will treat it as a cache hit towards the user and serve an old object while we do an asynchronous fetch and revalidate it to ensure that the next visitor has the up-to-date content. And if we do a soft purge, the only thing we do is set the TTL to 0. That's all we do. Logs, love logs, because they really prove the point. So the name Mark Schust was mentioned earlier in one of the presentations. Mark created a Docker image that I used, and I used the sample data. So I went to the Augusta earrings page that I invalidated with soft purging. However, when we do create the hash, so this very much reflects that finite state machine, we do a cache lookup and we get a hit. Great, cache hit. However, the TTL is minus 4.7. So 4.7 seconds ago, I invalidated the cache. So it should be a miss. However, the sum, this is 3 days, 259,200 seconds plus minus 4.7 is still greater than 0. So we do a hit, we deliver the hit to the user, there's no waiting time, but in the meanwhile, we will do a background fetch. And that will make all the difference, ladies and gentlemen. That will take away a lot of the pressure. However, it will keep the objects in cache longer than originally anticipated. So keep that in mind. Final piece of the puzzle before we end, and it's almost done, is by default, DNS resolution in VCL happens at compile time. So when you start, the DNS hostname will be resolved, and that IP will be kept for the duration of the runtime. Any changes to the hostname, Varnish won't be able to spot it. Any hostname resolving more than one IP will result in compilation errors. So the way we tackled that is by offering 2 extra modules, Active DNS and UDO. And those allow you to really tune how DNS resolution happens. You can abide to DNS TTLs, which come out are part of the DNS protocol, or you can force them like I do and say, every time we do a backend fetch, we'll re-resolve the DNS every 5 seconds. And whatever result comes out, we'll parse into the backend default and to probe health. We will parse it in. And then ultimately, we have this director object, and a director is a Varnish primitive that bundles multiple backends and exposes them as a single backend, but with distribution, load balancing, if you will. So you can do hash, fallback, random distribution. So in my case, it's random. And we do subscribe to any change that happens at the DNS level, which is great for orchestration, scale up, scale in scenarios. Wonderful. So that every time we have a cache miss and we need to get a backend, it will dynamically select the backend. And if you have multiple results, it will iterate over. And if it fails, it could retry and get the next one. So there is a level of resilience in here that is good in orchestrated environments. As if you do a DNS call, like a dig on your Linux or Mac system, you might get multiple responses, which it will load balance through. We call this DNS-based load balancing. However, there is support for SRV records. So if you have an SRV record, or your system has one, which is usually service name protocol.domain, not only do we get the host names, we also get the port numbers. So all of a sudden, you're no longer married to the port number of your system. And it gets out weights and priorities and decides how load balancing will happen. And all of this is controlled outside of Varnish in your DNS record, which is excellent if you're orchestrating things in Kubernetes. Because every Kubernetes service has its own DNS host name. So service name called Magento, running in the default namespace as a service, yada, yada, yada. That will work. However, if you want to elevate this, you could say, yes, that service in that default namespace, but I'm going to use the named port called HTTPS, which is a TCP service, and we'll get the port from it and the priorities and whatever you want. So that's it. I have a feeling we need to land the plane. Yeah. It is time. Let's land it. All of this, we can provide you with an optimized VCL file with all these features. So how do you get a hold of it? We have a Varnish for Magento product that you can find on our website. If you Google it, you'll definitely get a hold of it. Or the QR code while we do the Q&A, right? Is there still time for Q&A, or are we have 1 minute, right? Yes. Well, find me is the message, because we have a next speaker coming up. Perhaps find me, talk to me about it. I will leave the QR code up for another 5 seconds, right? Thank you. Merci à tous pour être venus. Et à la prochaine fois.